Hey everyone, welcome to our presentation today on hacking on bug bounties for 5 years. As an introduction, my name is Shubs. I've been hacking for a very long time now, especially in bug bounties. I'm the co-founder and CTO of AssetNote, and I've previously worked as a senior security analyst at a consulting company called Bishop Fox. I'm currently the #1 hacker on HackerOne in Australia, and I'm in the top 40 hackers worldwide.
Hey guys, I'm Sean. I work with Shubs at AssetNote. I'm the engineering lead. I've done a couple conference talks before, like DEF CON Cloud Village, Hack in the Box Singapore, and B-Sides Canberra. Most of my bug bounties these days is automating high and critical risk bugs. In the other times, I'm a Golang developer, and you may know me as the person who wrote Kite Runner.
So it all starts off with humble beginnings. I'm from an immigrant family that moved to Australia from India in the year 2000. That's almost 21 years ago. And my father, he always invested in computers at a young age for both my brother and I, even though we barely ever had the money. And as a result, I fell in love with hacking because I kept on losing at multiplayer games when I was playing with my brother, and I just wanted to beat my brother. So I really started getting into this realm of hacking, and I enjoyed learning about and practicing application security. I've been in the infosec industry officially for around 6 years. However, I've worked in small consulting firms, the big four, high-end consulting firms, and now I've co-founded a startup. When I was 14, I was working at Hungry Jack's in Western Sydney. Hungry Jack's is like a fast food restaurant here in Australia. In America, you'd have the equivalent, which is Burger King, but I was essentially making $6.50 an hour. And I worked there for around 8 months, and I learned that at the end, I only really made $800. In my free time, I spent it hacking all the time. That was all I was doing in my free time. And I dreamt that an industry existed where I could use my application security skills. It was very surprising to me that an industry did exist. And at the time, I had no idea that it did. So I was always dreaming about it. At the time, I was also submitting low-risk bugs on PayPal's bug bounty. The first bugs I reported to PayPal were absolutely terrible. Like, they were technically security issues, but they weren't that serious. And they were a result of me using scanners and not fully understanding the results, but sending in the results that scanners were returning. Big part of my methodology back then was to simply use Google Docs and look at interesting subdomains. Some of my first reported bugs to PayPal were some of these here, like Apache Tomcat disclosure, HTTP cookie disclosure, TLS issues, WAF disclosure, HTML forms without CSRF protection. As you understand these today, they won't really get paid out in any major bug bounty program. In fact, they're mostly in exclusion lists, and they're not bugs that companies are really looking for. But back then, as a 14-year-old, I was just trying to break into bug bounties. And one thing that we want to cover in this presentation is the journey from starting off in bug bounties all the way to the end at being really talented and successful at bug bounties. So this was where I started off. I started off with issues that were really not that important and not that serious from a security perspective. This was the sort of stuff that I was reporting when I first started getting into bug bounties. Some of these bugs were paid out. Some payouts were very small, but they made me realize that I could get paid for hacking. This blew my mind as a 14-year-old. I had no idea that an information security industry even existed. It motivated me to spend all of my time in learning more about application security. I worked really hard to get into as many Hall of Fame pages as possible because being acknowledged as a hacker really mattered to me at the time. And it was something that I thought was a really great way to get recognized for the efforts when you're hacking things. My first critical bug was a server-side request forgery bug. Through Google Dorking, I discovered an endpoint called merchants.billmelater.com, which took in a URL as input. It looked like an internal XML testing tool. So essentially, you would be able to provide an arbitrary URL, and it would respond with this table, which contained the contents of the response. With this, I could access internal hosts and read the full HTTP response from these internal hosts. PayPal accepted this issue, and they paid me 1,500 USD. That was the biggest payout I had ever received. I quit my job at Hungry Jack's immediately after that payout, and I never appeared at Hungry Jack's again.
Okay, so now it's like for where I started. And my background is I kind of had no background in security before I started university. In high school, I was just a student that played lots of video games, and I didn't really have much of an interest in programming. I tried once or twice to get into C++, but I was terrible. I had no concept of like what functions were. My friends would laugh at me because I just didn't understand any component of programming. So I came to university with very little idea of what I wanted to do myself. And I decided that, you know what, I'll just try some stuff that I tried before, but I was really bad at. Since then, it's been about 7 years since I started uni. I've played through tens, if not hundreds of CTFs. I've done consulting. I've interned at small tech companies. I've interned at big tech companies. I've lectured classes of like hundreds of students. And now I'm working full-time at AssetNote. So back to how I got started with bug bounties and security. In my first year of university, I remember seeing Mr. Shabam right here rock up to our university and do a talk about bug bounties. And I remember distinctly that I was walking along like our school main walkway, and there were like small posters put up talking about how we were doing they were doing a talk about making money by hacking games. And I was like, whoa, I play a lot of games. I know what those are. And it was talking about like specifically finding bugs on this certain large gaming company. I'll just call them CLG Co. And like I played a lot of games from CLG Co. I was like, well, I know what they do. And going through his talk, he kept talking about like he kept finding these bugs. Each one was $2,000, $5,000. And he just had slide after slide of these. And I was like, holy shit, that is a lot of money for something that I probably spend just as much time on as Shops, but doing completely opposite things. So that being said, I was thinking to myself probably later that week, like, I can do this too. It's not that hard. And I remember like I was reading off Reddit, and this one specific blog post came up about Joseph Frankovich talking about race conditions on Facebook. And I remember in that blog post, they were talking about, okay, like you can copy paste coupon codes, and if you spam them fast enough, then you can apply it multiple times. And I was just broadly thinking like, yeah, sure, there's plenty of like online shops around. Like, what about the ones in the CLG Co game? So my first bug that I reported was a copy paste bug off the internet. And to show you what it looked like, it pretty much, you start with the game and you have like these in-game currency points. Here I have 1,650 points. And then I literally replicated what he did in the blog post. I just took any one event that you purchase something. And in this case, you can see I'm purchasing a bunch of runes and I'm purchasing one champion. And you can see I'm specifying the costs, right? So like we can't arbitrarily specify how much we want to pay. We have to pay the correct amount. But what we notice is if I send all of these requests at the exact same time, I eventually end up with one extra champion, having only spent 3 points, which is incredible because this is effectively what the blog post discussed. And immediately after that, like I was ecstatic. Like the adrenaline rush started. Like, holy shit, I might have found something. So I reach out to Shabam and I ask him for help. And pretty much he's like, well, man, maybe you have a security bug. Here's just a template report I use all the time. Fill in all the blanks and then just submit it to the CLG Co. And I'm like, okay, sure, no problems. So I write up this report. It doesn't really make much sense. And then I submit it and I sort of forget about it. Like they don't really respond. And then a few months later, they start like sending me messages like, oh, okay, yeah, we're looking into your issue. And I'm skeptical whether it's even going to get fixed. So it's like, well, it doesn't really have any impact. It's just like you get to spend in-game points, right? And then 6 months later, they pay out $2,000. And to me, in a first-year uni student who's not working part-time, who's just accrued $10,000 of debt every year, getting $2,000 for effectively one night's worth of copy pasting is insane. I get the spike of dopamine when I see the dollar figure, and I'm totally hooked. So from that point on, it's only been going upwards and understanding more about it. But that being said, let's go through some quick tips of what we learned at the beginning.
So before you start hunting, if you're looking to get into bug bounties, your application security skills must be sharp. And this is really important because bug bounties do require a good comprehensive knowledge of application security skills. Most bug bounties, with a few exceptions, are rewarded for bugs in web applications. Web application security itself is actually a huge field to navigate. There are client-side issues, server-side issues, cloud platform-specific issues, and these must all be studied and practiced before approaching bug bounties. You can learn a lot by practicing WebSec Academy's labs, or even looking through the courses on Pentester Lab. However, I will say that, as someone who's looking to get into bug bounties, having a good fundamental knowledge of application security skills is absolutely vital to your success. Another thing that's really important is writing high quality reports. Often you'll find vulnerabilities, but it is your report that is conveying the seriousness and the criticality of your vulnerabilities. So the better your report is, the more likely you're going to be paid out a decent amount of money. If your reports are easy and legible to understand, that's less time that the company has to spend to remediate the issue. And ultimately, they can reward you for that amazing report that you send in. Over time, I've had to make an effort to become better at reporting and reminding myself of the value of good reports. A report should usually contain a summary, steps to reproduce, supporting materials, and impact. You can have other things in the report, but this is typically what I include in my reports. So let's go back in time and let's think about 2015, getting started full time. So initially starting to hunt on bug bounties, it can be pretty daunting. So the most important thing is that you're spending some time looking for bugs and trying different ideas on your target. Having a friend that you can compete with is actually a really good thing, and I highly recommend it. It's really productive, and it will motivate you to spend more time looking for bugs, especially if you're a competitive person. Setting healthy goals, like 1 bug a week/month, can be a good way to commit to finding bugs initially as well. And another thing is building your rep and profile on these bug bounty platforms will prove to be pretty important in the future as a bug bounty hunter. It will lead to things like more invites to private programs and even potentially invites to live hacking events. There's still so much low-hanging fruit out there. You just need to be looking for it. So this is one of the bugs that I found when I was first getting into bounties seriously. And I essentially nmapped all of the assets I could discover on the attack surface and discovered the port 6389 on an asset. Now 6389 is typically used by Redis, and by using Netcat, I could basically connect to this server on this port, and I identified an exposed Redis server. With this, I could list all the values, I could potentially get command execution, I could DOS the machine, and there was even second order attacks by sending malicious values. At the end, they only really paid $500 for this because I couldn't prove impact beyond just setting and getting the keys. So this was a really low risk bug, but at the end of the day, it still got paid a decent amount of money at the time, and it was a successful find. Another bug in a similar vein was an exposed HA proxy statistics panel. So again, I ran an nmap scan across all their assets, found an open port on 4444, and going to this asset, I found a HA proxy statistics panel. Really simple vulnerability, again, really low-hanging fruit, very limited information disclosure, outdated software, potential DOS, but it got paid out $500. And again, this is just when I started off in bounties. This isn't going to the more complex side. This is just simple vulnerabilities that I was reporting at the time. Then I started reporting things like open administration interfaces. Some bug bounty programs actually value this sort of submission because they don't expect any of their administration interfaces to be on the external internet. So I reported this to this program, and they also paid a $500 bounty. It's important to remember that this is 5 years ago, and I wasn't as experienced or talented back then. All of these bugs, again, are really simple to find and were things that I found just by doing some basic reconnaissance on all of these targets. I tried to be a little cheeky. I thought, okay, I found one open administration interface. What if I've actually found multiple? What if I report all of them as separate reports? Are they going to pay $500 per report? Now, one thing I can say to the broader community and people who are watching this is almost always, when you find an instance of a vulnerability repeated across an attack surface, most companies aren't going to pay for each individual report. They're usually going to close it as a duplicate. So I tried reporting this same issue across different assets in multiple reports, but they ended up paying for it only once, and they only that's how they treated the vulnerability. Some programs do prefer it being batched up into a single report. Other programs might prefer it being in each separate reports, but this is something that you have to experiment with bug bounty programs. It really depends on the program and what their preference is. But in this instance, I tried to be a little cheeky, and it didn't really work out. It closed all the extra reports I made as duplicates. And here's some more low-risk bugs that I found 5 years ago. So open administration interfaces, reflected cross-site scripting, information disclosure in DOS, URL redirection, again, open admin interfaces, and also some exposed network devices. Many more of these low-risk bugs were found 5 years ago. And the reason why I'm going into so much detail about these low-risk bugs is to give you some perspective about what it was like when I first started in bug bounties. I didn't just start immediately making a large amount of money in bug bounties or finding critical vulnerabilities when I first started. And I don't think it's reasonable to expect anyone to do that as soon as they start bug bounties. But it was a slow process, and it was something that I developed over time. These were some of the low-risk bugs in that process. The last thing that I want to point out is a high payout does not necessarily mean that the bug was complex or hard to exploit. So this example was a simple subdomain hijacking bug, subdomain takeover bug, and it got paid out $7.5 grand. It was really simple to exploit and find the vulnerability. However, the reason it got paid out such a high amount of money is because of the impact it had for this particular customer on HackerOne. And they recognized the impact, and they paid out based on that impact. Along the way, I also had a lot of NA bugs. So here's an example of some of the bugs that were not applicable and were denied a bug bounty entirely. This is natural. So if you're starting to get into bug bounties, this does happen, and you shouldn't be too bummed out by it. It should give you a good understanding of what is an acceptable bug and what isn't an acceptable bug. And you should be formulating your opinion on what bugs to report based on the experience you have from the NA bugs that you've received in the past. I don't really have any bugs that get classified as NA these days. Most of my bugs do get triaged and do get paid out because I have had the experience and I've gone through the process of understanding what is a bug that's actually valuable to a company versus what isn't. I think what's really important to remember is focusing on the impact it has to the company before reporting it. If the bug doesn't really have any security impact, it's most likely going to end up as an NA bug. So the retrospective, competition between other bug bounty hunters, that really helped me. That really facilitated growth for me. And it helped me innovate in the field of bug bounties because I wanted to beat any people that I was competing with. It was also important to have the right mindset and coming up with logical plans and executing them. Low-hanging fruit is literally everywhere. You can always capitalize on this if you're looking hard enough. And another thing I realized in this process 5 years ago was that hacking on bug bounty programs is actually pretty addictive because when you receive the bounty, it usually causes a rush of happiness. And that's something I recognized that I really enjoyed and wanted to continue. So I reported low to medium bugs for most of that year, but I was pretty happy that companies recognized my efforts and paid out my bug reports. And ultimately, the impact determines the payout. Simple bugs can still be very impactful and still be rewarded a large amount of money.
So in contrast to Shubs, who spent most of 2015 doing full-time bug bounties, I was still going on with my uni degree. So I didn't necessarily have as much time or freedom to do this each and every week. And I realized that from Shabam's talk and chatting to him after the first bug I reported, he has a whole wealth of already knowledge and experience in exploring large attack surfaces, whereas I probably didn't have as much expertise in filtering through so many results. So instead, I opted to look at things I was familiar with and probably things I had more an in-depth understanding of how things worked. And that being said, I spent most of my time studying in 2015, and I instead only opted to do bug bounties as short bursts of like a couple weeks between semesters or during downtimes. And I only really submitted about like 2 or 3 bugs in this entire like 2 or 3 period. I don't necessarily advise dropping out to do bug bounties full time instead of studying, but I can say like there's two sides of the coin that you really want to pursue. One of the major bugs that I did report that I was quite surprised about, honestly, was in the same CLG core. They have a thick client application, and this is notoriously difficult to typically reverse and intercept with things like burp proxy because you can't just like point your browser at it, right? It's wrapped inside its own thick application. So after a lot of fiddling around, I figured out how to open up this application as my system proxy. And I started understanding a bit more about how the store that I previously hacked worked. And this is like noticeably a very different client to what you saw in the previous screenshots because they've drastically changed in the period of time between the first time I hacked them and the second time again looking at them. And digging through their website, I realized that, wow, this is just another poorly written web app at the end of the day. And surprisingly enough, behind all the layers of like complexity and challenges of trying to set up a proxy around it, you can still pop XSS. And at the end of the day, even the simplest bugs still yield great results. In something I thought would have been well covered, turns out is probably a bit more difficult to understand. That being said, I think throughout this period, there also were heaps of dupes that I did submit amongst these like couple that were legitimately reported. And some of them were just as simple as like reporting CVE bugs. Admittedly, this was back in 2015. So when Drupal bugs pop, not everyone jumped on it within 24 hours. There still was plenty of lead time for you to exploit them. But this is what it looks like doing bug bounties while you're studying. And there's still plenty of opportunity to both go wide and go deep with your knowledge and expertise.
Cool. From 2016 to 2018, there was a real focus on techniques. So, after getting my feet wet in bug bounties, I focused on techniques that could amplify the severity of my bugs and the payouts I was receiving. This often involved being pretty creative and identifying weak spots in attack surfaces that could be reliably targeted when approaching targets. In order to do this and amplify the severity, I spent less time on client-side issues, and I started focusing on server-side bugs instead. This evolution was necessary in order to be more successful in making higher payouts and bounties, and also it was necessary to have persistence when executing these ideas. An open mind is also necessary to come up with ideas that may work. In order to execute on those ideas, you must first believe that it's possible. One of the examples is, this bug that had multiple steps to victory. The bug's title was ability to write arbitrary scripts to this subdomain and another subdomain through a misconfigured S3 bucket. However, while that might seem pretty straightforward that there was a misconfigured S3 bucket, the steps to discovering the S3 bucket were actually really tricky. And if there's something that you can take away from this presentation, what I would love for it to be is that never to underestimate the value of good reconnaissance, because sometimes good reconnaissance might require a large number of steps or complicated number of steps that lead to the vulnerabilities. To find this bug, there are at least 7 steps involved, starting at the company's blog and ending up at an exposed API that disclosed an S3 bucket that the company was using. The bucket was in use by several applications, and you could write to it as an anonymous user. So I guess what I'd like to convey is, don't be afraid to dig deeper. Sometimes digging deeper leads to gold, and this was the case in this bug. This bug was paid out $7.5 grand due to the impact it had to the company. Another example when it comes to focusing on techniques is second-order takeovers. So let's say, for example, your company uses saasservice1.com, and it embeds content from that service across your blog site. If you've embedded links from this service, and you might have these links embedded all over the place, what happens on the day that you stop using this service and you delete your account from their systems? Can someone else potentially claim these links? Are these embedded links still present in all of your blog posts? If that's the case, what happens if an attacker just registers on this saasservice1.com website and registers an account with the same name as yours? Can they now claim all of those links? In that case, an attacker could take over all the pages within the blog posts. So that's exactly what happened in this case. And I was able to take over a bunch of blog post pages through this SaaS service called Wufoo, which is a forms service. So I could replace all the forms inside these blog posts with my own forms. Another technique that I really started focusing on throughout these years was expanding the scope. So one thing when it comes to approaching bug bounties is having the right mindset. And many programs out there, they consider any asset owned by them to be in scope. Now, this isn't the case for all the programs, but I certainly know some companies like Uber, for example, that really do have this open mindset about anything owned by us is in scope, except for some exceptions. And I realized that some of these large companies, they operate in almost every country in the world. So surely there are assets that are deployed in specific regions or countries that may not be as secure as the company's main assets. That was the main hypothesis. And that hypothesis was proven again and again. And it's led to the discovery of critical vulnerabilities time after time. It's all about finding weaknesses and blind spots in the attack surface.
So around this point in time, Shubs and myself started collaborating on more bugs. And at this point, he was really into looking at like a specific transport company and across these different countries. So in Russia, transport.co.ru was a contracted division to run the transport co in that country, as the case with most multinational tech companies. And prior to transport.co introducing like a businesses and collaboration or like coordination feature in the US, there was sampling trialing in Russia, where you could hire other users and recruit other users. And what we found was our initial entry point was a specific subdomain botapi.transport.co.ru, which led us to a Telegram bot that let you like manage your transport co drivers. And Shub started hopping on chat with this Telegram bot. And here you can see him having a very fascinating discussion in Russian. And we couldn't actually really make the link initially between this transport bot and transport co until we started clicking through the links it offered, and then it sent us to this random Russian sounding website. And starting to do some reconnaissance and brute forcing on this box, we noticed this was a pretty dirty box. And when I say dirty, I mean, you could see a developer was probably writing scripts on this box and using this box as their primary means of development. So we started going through the directories and started clicking through some of these files. And it turns out that these files is just the source code for what's running on the website. So this completely changed from like a reconnaissance mission to now a source auditing and just straight up shelling straight through the box. Clicking through some more scripts, you could see more dodgy things. There was a script called test2.php, and here it just listed a whole bunch of what we presume are phone numbers and usernames, or like users. And going through more scripts, there was another test.php script, and this one just started putting out debug information, and we couldn't really make sense of it at first. But looking deeply at it, you can see there's some words that say Google Service Sheets, and then this spreadsheet ID. And we were thinking like, what could this spreadsheet ID possibly be for? Well, if you recognize the format, that's the spreadsheet ID for Google Sheets. So we copy pasted that into Google Sheets, and out came all the user data for users of this application. Now, turns out what was happening was the Transport Co. Russia like subsidiary or like contracted company was managing all their user data in one big Google Sheet. And then they wrote a PHP app to wrap the data for the Google Sheet so they could interface it with it from their Telegram app. What ended up happening is we managed to get the email addresses, the phone numbers, and then the banking details for all of these Transport Co. drivers in Russia. Now, you may be thinking like, what can you do with banking details? In this case, the banking SWIFT and BIC numbers can be used to initiate international transfers against like without the owner's knowledge or will. So that's actually pretty insane if you think about it. We could have accessed thousands of users of bank accounts if we really wanted to go down the fraud path. Thankfully, we just reported it to the Transport Co. and they paid out for $4,500 for effectively looking at scope that was outside of what they listed in their scope, they're definitely still owned and managed by the company because it affected their users. That being said, I don't recommend randomly going and hacking other companies' services because there's no guarantee they own it. Please make sure you do your due diligence and check that specific company.co actually owns this random other company you're hacking and you're not accidentally now becoming full illegal.
And another successful strategy when it comes to looking at techniques is looking at third-party platforms. So I've been pretty successful with looking at information disclosure on third-party platforms. Now, what does that really mean? What do third-party platforms mean? So third-party platforms include like source code repositories on GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, knowledge base articles on ServiceNow, internal documentation on Atlassian products. But in all of these examples, there's often the scenario that sensitive information is leaked. And when sensitive information is leaked, it can often lead to vulnerabilities, or the disclosure of just even having that information leaked could be a valid vulnerability report. One of the examples that I had was visiting a WebEx subdomain for this company. And I was able to see and potentially join on any of the upcoming scheduled meetings. I thought that this was pretty interesting because it was actually not a vulnerability directly in the company's infrastructure, but rather a misconfiguration in one of the SaaS products that this company used. This bug was paid out $500. Another example of leveraging third-party platforms is on GitHub. I found the following snippet of code for a very large conglomerate running a bug bounty. Basically, it had a subdomain dropbox.company.com and what looked to be FTP credentials. These credentials were valid, and it was possible to upload files to the FTP server. This led to persistent XSS because at the time, Flash still existed, and it was possible to leverage Flash to get persistent XSS. Thank God that Flash is dead today. Another really cool technique is dangling IP subdomain takeovers. So when an EC2 instance is started, it gets assigned an Elastic IP. AWS manages a huge address space, including all the Elastic IPs that are assigned to instances. In many cases, subdomains are pointing to Elastic IPs that belong to an EC2 instance. What happens when the EC2 instance is destroyed? Well, in that scenario, the Elastic IP might get released into the pool again, and someone else may claim that IP at random. So what happens to the subdomains that are pointing to the Elastic IP? Well, someone else can potentially control the contents of that subdomain, as they may now own the Elastic IP those subdomains are pointing to. You can often detect this by checking SSL certificates and seeing whether or not the subdomain is pointing to a completely different company or asset. But there is no such API on AWS that lets you easily detect this. If there was, then this would be a much easier thing to find, discover, and report. However, nothing exists out there that lets you detect this. Some bug bounty hunters out there, they're continuously claiming Elastic IPs from the pool to be able to take over subdomains pointing to dangling Elastic IPs. This is what is called the lottery approach. And this approach is being taken by many hackers in the bug bounty community in order to do Elastic IP takeovers. I often report this issue to bug bounties. Either it's a third-party subdomain hijack or I actually do take over the IP. But in many cases, it can get paid out $100 to $2,000. It really depends on the severity and impact. Here's an example report where I reported dangling IP subdomain takeover. This was an example where the response clearly indicated that it no longer belonged to the company. This is not an example of where I've actually taken over the IP. This is just an example where I've noticed that the IP no longer belongs to the company. So finally, a retrospective. From 2016 to 2018, we were still finding low-hanging fruit. Like low-hanging fruit still exists today, and there's still plenty of it. We spent a lot more time coming up with ideas and following through with execution. And this is a natural progression when it comes to becoming good at bug bounties. You will naturally progress into coming up with ideas, techniques, and different strategies that you will execute with some confidence. Once you've done that, you will realize that there's a lot of possibilities of making a lot of money in bug bounties. Another thing that we did throughout this time period is that we focused less on client-side issues and we focused more on server-side issues due to severity. Mostly the highest severity vulnerabilities are found on server-side from server-side issues. One thing that was absolutely key when it came to all of this was persistence. Often bugs were found after a complicated chain of events. So it's really important that when you're hacking on bug bounties or hacking in general, that you're really persistent. And lastly, we spent a lot of time mapping out attack surfaces in different regions and countries. This led to a couple of really successful bugs and findings that we submitted to programs. Now, lastly, I want to talk about 2018 to 2021. I want to talk a little bit about reconnaissance, IDORs, 0 days, and automation. So in the last few years of bug bounty hunting, recon was something that had become second nature to me due to how repetitive the process is. I defined what recon really meant to me and how I think other hackers should think about it too when they think about it. I tried not to deviate from my processes related to it. And I found systemic issues in bug bounty programs and exploited them for a steady train of bounties and high severity bugs. Identifying weaknesses in attack surfaces holistically is what led to this success. There was also a small shift to focus on source code analysis so that I could find 0 day vulnerabilities in vendor products and report those 0 days to bug bounty programs. One thing that I want to do right now is define reconnaissance and recon in general. When I think about reconnaissance, I think about it in two streams. I think about it in the breadth and depth. There are two separate concepts when you look at reconnaissance. Breadth might mean that you're enumerating all of the subdomains, you're enumerating all of the endpoints, and you're enumerating all of the cloud resources, finding related domains, looking at third-party platforms. Depth, on the other hand, is looking at things like reverse engineering JavaScript, discovering and testing all the request parameters, testing for Route 53 and Elastic IP takeovers, detecting all technologies and versions across an attack surface, and analyzing code within the repos written by the organizational employees. You can see how these two separate concepts of reconnaissance kind of work hand in hand. And I think that what's really tricky is not many people have had a go at defining what reconnaissance actually means. I think that's why it's pretty important to, convey what my meaning of reconnaissance is to people who are watching this. I really do think of reconnaissance in these two different streams, breadth and depth. And if you can think about all the different things you can do for these two different streams, I think you can be really successful at reconnaissance. You have to do a good job at every element of reconnaissance to make sure you haven't missed anything. But it is one of the most critical steps when looking for bugs. And when you perform recon, it's not that difficult. You just need to put the time in. Recon is time consuming, but it can lead to amazing bugs being found. And once you follow these concepts of breadth and depth, you can always ask yourself, can I take this concept further? Can I go deeper? You can follow your hunches, you can build up instinct and get better indications of when something may lead to vulnerabilities. I spend a lot of time these days reverse engineering JavaScript to find endpoints, parameters, expected values, and schemas. This is often a necessary step in a lot of the vulnerabilities that I find these days. One of my favorite bounties to hack on is a food ordering platform. They represent everything as UUIDs. User IDs, vehicle IDs, restaurant IDs, order IDs, everything is a UUID. I reported a lot of access control issues to this company from 2018 to 2021. Some of these vulnerabilities were as simple as putting someone else's user UUID in as mine, but some bugs were a bit more impactful than others. One of my favorite bugs, all I needed to do was obtain a UUID of a restaurant that I wanted to test the bug on. So essentially, I went to this website, I clicked on the store, and as soon as I clicked on the store, it gave me the UUID for the store inside the URL. So once I had obtained this UUID for the store, we could move on to the next step of the exploit. There was this request that I could forge, where essentially I could replace my UUID with this restaurant's UUID, and I could essentially close down this shop early, and sending this request would essentially close down this shop. I didn't think it was going to work, but after I sent the request, this is what it looked like, currently unavailable. The funny thing is that I actually didn't really like the kebabs that much from this shop anyways, but obviously I reported this bug as soon as I found it, and it was something that was considered pretty important and high severity at the time. I never really expected it to work, and I was pretty surprised when it did work. So IDORs, for this company, it was a systemic problem. And I've demonstrated with this example that IDOLs can have major implications. Sometimes the IDOL vulnerability class is a systemic issue for a company, and it occurs throughout many applications and assets. So this was the case for a lot of the programs that I was participating in. So really did specialize in finding IDOLs throughout this period of time. And I still consider, at the end of the day, I still consider IDOLs as low-hanging fruit, to be completely honest. Lastly, another thing I want to talk about is 0 days. I spent a lot of time from 2018 to 2021 finding vulnerabilities in the following software: Oracle EBS, WebSphere, Jira, Confluence, and secure file transfer software. I also looked at Django and Python libraries. So for example, Django HBAD still has a SQL injection, still unpatched, so technically a 0 day. And also cloud configuration issues, like AWS misconfigurations and exploiting them. All of this led to significant bugs being found in bug bounties. It's been really rewarding, but it has required a really different skill set, which is source code analysis. This has been rewarding not only for bug bounties, but also at my current job at Asset, which requires this sort of stuff. The barrier of entry when it comes to finding 0 days isn't that high anymore, because you can often find software and deploy it on Azure and AWS Marketplace and deploy these vendor applications without forking huge license fees. Alternatively, you can also find vendor applications on Docker Hub and simply spin up a container with that vendor software. Static source code analysis is still an extremely effective way to find vulnerabilities in this vendor software, and obtaining the source code is often trivial when it's Java. A lot of vendors, what they're banking on is the fact that you won't be able to discover vulnerabilities because you don't even have a copy of the software. So sometimes the biggest barrier in finding vulnerabilities in enterprise software is surprisingly actually getting access to the software itself.
On that, I think one thing to note is that a lot of different kinds of software, such as .NET apps, Java apps, actually let you reverse to effectively the full source. There's plenty of decompilers that, if you're given a .NET DLL, actually just spit out the original source code. Even to some degree, if you can find compiled Python binaries to PYC files, those can be decompiled and unpacked to give you nearly the original Python source. So even a lot of the time with applications that you think are probably too big or too complex, at the end of the day, with enough tooling, you can actually get back to a point where it's just normal source code auditing at the end of the day. Next, I wanted to talk about is automation. And over the past few years, I come from a software engineering background. I did computer science. So instead of spending my time diving deep into building out, understanding bugs super hard, I was working on trying to make things a lot easier for myself using the skills I had. And some of the things that we've managed to automate over the last few years that have yielded very well over Bounties include Route 53 takeovers, EIP takeovers, research we automated from Bishop Fox, like HTC smuggling. We've also to some degree automated JavaScript change detection. And these automations have effectively shortcutted the recon process for us, because a lot of the time, if you chain enough things together, you get to a point where you get to cut out a lot of the noise, especially with things like EIP takeovers and Route 53 takeovers. It's very expensive to manually validate these, but it's very easy to do it in an automated fashion. And once you have that, you now just have a pipeline where you just maintain the pipeline occasionally, and you just have bugs print out into your Slack channel every day.
Yeah.
So going over 2018 to 2021, we can have a short retrospective and have a look at what things are probably useful. As Shov spoke about, taking both a breadth and depth approach allows you to cover a lot more than just going for one or the other. It's important to make sure you consider both, because just having a large list of subdomains isn't too helpful if you don't actually manage to investigate anything on them. Shubs managed to exploit a wide range of IDORs. In a lot of cases, even when UUIDs are used, and you think this makes it a lot more difficult than just incrementing integers. Furthermore, analyzing vendor software and middleware across various pieces of enterprise software to find 0 days is actually surprisingly effective. And ultimately, this helps both the people running the bug bounty as well as the vendors. We found a lot of success over this the past few years. And finally, reporting cloud security misconfiguration issues, especially in AWS environments, has been very lucrative, especially as more and more companies moved to cloud-based infrastructure away from their on-prem or traditional data center models.
And lastly, don't be let down when you have periods of time that you can't find bugs. This was a tweet that I tweeted last year in October, where for a period of months I just found nothing, and it felt like I couldn't hack at all. I felt like the worst hacker in the world. So keep on doing what you're doing and fight the imposter syndrome. Um, if you're interested in learning a bit more about our journey in bug bounties, you can read the blog post here on hacking on bug bounties for 4 years and high frequency security bug hunting 120 days to 120 bugs. These two resources are a good retrospective about all of the bugs we've found over time and go into a lot of detail about what the bugs were and how much they were paid out.